My mother looked me in the eyes and said, "You've always been the mistake in this family." No yelling, just that one sentence and the door closing behind me. For years, no one asked where I went. If you've ever been erased in silence, leave a dot and subscribe to this channel. I was 17 the first time I realized I was utterly, unquestionably alone. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No screaming, no slammed doors, no tear-soaked confrontations. It was far quieter than that. Quieter and far more brutal. We were sitting at the dinner table, my father at the head, still in his work shirt tie, loosened but collar stiff. My mother picking at her food, talking at Jamie about his latest rugby win, and me, Elise Walker, sitting across from an empty chair because no one ever sat next to me anymore. I could have left mid-meal and no one would have noticed. I could have choked on the roast chicken and no one would have paused to ask why I wasn't speaking. I was the ghost they fed out of obligation. I had just gotten my early acceptance letter from the engineering program at Halston University. It was supposed to be one of those life-defining moments, the kind where a family cheers, hugs you, maybe even opens champagne. I had placed the letter on the table, carefully waiting. No one touched it. No one even looked. Mom glanced at it once and said flatly, "That's far from home, isn't it?" That was it. Not congratulations, not we're proud of you. Just the subtext wrapped neatly inside those 5 words, "You leaving is inconvenient. You leaving does not benefit us." I swallowed hard, nodded, and stayed quiet. Jamie made some joke about how I'd probably blow up a lab, and they all laughed like I wasn't sitting right there. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan spinning above me, listening to the echo of their laughter. My throat burned. Not from tears, I had learned how to hold those back, but from swallowing so many moments that should have belonged to me. The next morning, I overheard Mom on the phone with Aunt Lydia. She was standing in the kitchen, voice low, but not low enough. She's different. Always has been. Cold. Honestly, sometimes I wonder if she's even mine. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I stood at the top of the stairs holding my backpack like an anchor. That sentence carved something out of me I didn't know I had left. I wasn't hurt. I was done. That night, I packed a single bag. A few clothes, a charger, my acceptance letter, and a notebook I'd filled with plans. Things I'd build, places I'd live, the kind of woman I'd become. And none of it included their approval. When I came down the stairs, Mom was in the living room. She looked up and frowned. "Where do you think you're going with that?" I looked her straight in the eye for the first time in months. "Anywhere but here," she scoffed. "You're being dramatic." I almost smiled, that word again. They always said I was too much, too intense, too Elise. But I wasn't dramatic. I was finished. Dad barely looked up from the television. Jamie didn't even glance my way. And I remember thinking clearer than anything I'd ever thought before, this isn't my family. It never was. I walked out in the rain, the duffel bag heavy on my shoulder. The porch light flickered behind me, casting a long shadow across the front yard. The house looked warm from the outside, cozy even, but I knew better. I knew what lived inside that warmth, neglect, conditional love, a hunger for obedience. I didn't run away, I didn't slam the door, I simply left. Silence doesn't mean defeat. Sometimes it's strategy. The bus station smelled like bleach and old coffee. I handed the clerk $50 and said, "Wherever this gets me." She didn't ask questions. I liked her for that. That night, I sat on the Greyhound forehead against the glass, watching the highway bleed into itself. I didn't cry. I didn't text anyone goodbye. My phone buzzed twice. Unknown numbers. I turned it off. They called me a failure. Today they call me doctor. But back then, I was just a girl who wanted to be seen and instead became someone no one could ignore. I thought I'd never see them again. But I was wrong. 7 years later, I'd walk into a courtroom and watch my mother flinch because the daughter she discarded was now the woman holding the future in her hands. They never came looking for me. Not a single call, not a message, not even a half-hearted attempt to reach out through someone else. For weeks, I kept checking my phone like a fool, thinking maybe Jamie would send a text, or Dad, with his usual 2-word replies, would say something. Or maybe Mom would leave one of her sharp-voiced voicemails full of judgment, but at least it would mean she noticed I was gone. But nothing came. The silence wasn't empty. It was loud, deafening, a confirmation of what I already suspected. They were relieved. I moved into a small apartment above a closed flower shop on the edge of a city that never felt like mine. It smelled like dust and cold tile. The windows leaked air in the winter and sweat in the summer, but it was mine. The first space in the world where I wasn't shrinking myself to fit. I worked nights at a diner, took classes during the day, ate canned soup, and saved every dollar like it was a weapon, and it was. Money was freedom. Money was exit. And I was preparing to never need anyone again. At the diner, I met people who didn't know anything about me, and that made it easier to breathe. One of the cooks, Lisa, always called me college girl, even when I hadn't slept in 3 days. She had this laugh that sounded like it came from a place of survival, like she'd lost things too, but decided to laugh anyway. I liked her for that. We became friends in the way that people do when they have nothing to offer each other but time and tired hearts. She never asked about my family. I never volunteered. She once told me, the ones who leave early are the ones who stay whole. I didn't ask what she meant. I just nodded. I understood it too well. Some nights after the diner closed and the city quieted, I'd sit on the roof of the building, knees pulled to my chest, staring at the stars barely visible between smog and light. I'd imagine other versions of me, a version who stayed home, who played nice, who smiled more, who followed all the rules. But then I'd remember what playing nice got me. Invisible. Erased. So I let that version of myself die in the house I left behind. My anger didn't explode. It calcified, turned into bone. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was plotting survival. I didn't want them to suffer. I just wanted them to know what it felt like to be forgotten, to be spoken about in past tense, to be a ghost that only came up when it was convenient to blame. One day I checked my email and saw something from Halston. A scholarship, full ride. It didn't feel real. I read the subject line 5 times before I opened it. Then I reread the letter twice before printing it and taping it to the cracked wall above my bed. No one clapped for me. No one celebrated. So I clapped for myself. And that night I went to work like it was just another shift. But inside something shifted. Something permanent. They told me I was cold, unemotional, that I wasn't like them. They were right. And thank God for that. In my second year, I started tutoring other students to make extra money, the ones who were loud in class but broke apart quietly in office hours. I saw myself in them, and maybe they saw something in me too, not kindness necessarily, but structure, focus, fire. One of my professors, Dr. Brandt, pulled me aside after a lecture and said, "You have a mind that doesn't quit, Elise. But more than that, you have something rare. You know how to listen in silence." That moment, it stayed with me, because no one had ever said I was a listener before. They always said I was difficult, cold, aloof, the girl who didn't know how to smile properly. But Dr. Brandt saw something else, and maybe for the first time, I started seeing it too. The truth is, I didn't want to prove them wrong anymore. I wanted to prove me right. 3 years passed. Fast, brutal, beautiful. I graduated top of my class with no family in the crowd to cheer, but I didn't look for them. Not even once. I walked across that stage, shook hands, took my degree, and smiled quietly, because I knew what they didn't. I wasn't coming back, but fate doesn't always ask permission, because just when I thought I had buried them for good, a name appeared on my phone. Jamie. I stared at it for a long time, thumb hovering over decline. I hadn't heard his voice in over 4 years. When I finally answered, the line was quiet. A pause. Then in a voice I barely recognized, he said, "Elise, Mom wants to talk to you. Something's happened." And I felt it then. The old house breathing again. The ghosts stirring. The past hadn't let me go. It was coming back. And this time I wasn't a girl with a backpack and silence. I was a woman with a memory sharp enough to cut. When Jamie said something's happened, I thought someone died. That's what it sounded like. His voice was hollow, fragile, like a truth he didn't know how to carry. But when he told me the real reason, it wasn't death. It was scandal. Mom was facing public charges. Fraud, they said. Misuse of community funds from the volunteer foundation she had co-chaired for almost a decade. Apparently, one of the accountants blew the whistle. Local media had already picked it up. There were headlines. And shame finally had entered the house that once sent me out for being an embarrassment. She's not in jail. Jamie clarified quickly as if I cared. But they're threatening to revoke her position, strip her from all boards. She might lose everything. Everything. As if I didn't know exactly what that meant to our mother. Everything wasn't about livelihood or justice. No. Everything meant reputation, image, the illusion of moral superiority she'd curated like a carefully arranged mantelpiece, one that I never fit on. He kept talking. Something about lawyers, something about how they needed a character witness, a public statement. You're a doctor now, Elise. You have credibility. You could help. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because for the first time in my life, Jamie said it, out loud. You have credibility. I wanted to ask him where that belief was when I was 18, living on instant noodles and insomnia, where that recognition was when he watched me pack a suitcase and leave without saying goodbye. But I didn't ask, because I already knew the answer. It only mattered now because they needed something. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't mean it. But I also didn't hang up. Something about hearing his voice, hearing the tension, the desperation he didn't want to admit, it scraped against something old and unhealed in me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling just like I used to, only this time the ceiling was mine. This apartment, this life, everything I'd built without them, it was solid earned. Paid in full with tears they never saw and strength they never taught me. And now they wanted access to that strength. Now when theirs was running out, I got out of bed and opened the box at the back of my closet. I hadn't touched it in years. Inside were a few things I couldn't throw away, no matter how hard I tried a photo of me at my first science fair, holding a ribbon no one clapped for, a copy of the acceptance letter to Halston still folded along the same lines, and a birthday card from Aunt Lydia, the only family member who ever sent one after I left. I sat on the floor with those things spread around me like relics from a life that still whispered, and I thought about going back, not for them, but for me, to look my mother in the eye, not as the girl she discarded, but as the woman she couldn't erase. 2 days later, I booked the train. No one knew I was coming. I wore black, a coat, a scarf, everything clean, professional, guarded. The armor of a woman who knew exactly who she was now. No lipstick, no smile, just presence. When I stepped off the platform, Jamie was already there. He looked older, tired, softer in a way I didn't expect. Elise, he said, half shocked, half guilty. Jamie. We didn't hug. He offered to carry my bag. I let him. The car ride was quiet. The city had barely changed. Same crooked stop signs, same rusted swings at the park I used to sit on during family barbecues I was never really invited to, only tolerated at. When we pulled into the driveway of the old house, something cold slid through me. The porch still creaked. The mailbox still leaned. The house looked smaller now, or maybe I had just outgrown the lies it was built on. Jamie opened the door and there she was, my mother. She didn't look at me right away. She was seated at the dining table, hands clenched around a glass of water. Her posture was still perfect, her lipstick still unbothered. But her eyes, they looked like someone had finally told her the rules no longer applied. She stood slowly. Elise, she said, as if my name tasted strange in her mouth. You look, well, I nodded. I didn't return the compliment. She gestured for me to sit. I didn't. There was a long silence, then finally, I know we weren't close, she began, but this family is under attack, and we need to present unity. I was hoping you'd consider issuing a statement, something to help balance the narrative. Balance the narrative, as if truth was something to be edited, as if unity was something you could photocopy for press releases. I took a breath, measured, controlled. You mean lie for you? She blinked. Not from surprise, but from recognition. Yes, she said softly, if that's what it takes. And there it was. The honesty I never got when I was bleeding on their kitchen floor. She was finally willing to ask for what she always wanted my silence. But she didn't know silence was no longer her weapon. It was mine. I turned to her, not cold, not cruel, just steady. I'm not here to protect your reputation, Mother. Then why did you come? I paused, let the silence stretch, then said, to show you what real consequences look like. Her face froze, then cracked. Jamie shifted uncomfortably in his seat. No one said a word. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't a return. It was a reckoning. I didn't stay the night. After that conversation, I stood, gathered my coat, and left the house I used to dream about escaping. Only this time, there was no suitcase, no rain, no trembling hands, just a straight back, a quiet jaw, and a silence that pressed against the walls like smoke. Jamie walked me to the curb. Elise, she's not well. The stress she's unraveling. I looked at him, really looked. And for a second, I saw the boy who used to steal my notebooks and laugh when I cried. But now he looked lost, thinner. His voice wasn't just defensive, it was pleading, not for her, for all of them. I'm not here for her downfall, I said evenly, but I'm not here to cushion it either. He nodded, but I could tell he still didn't fully understand. They never really understood. That night, I checked into a hotel downtown, nothing fancy, just clean and silent. I poured myself a glass of water, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at my reflection in the darkened window. I looked steady, not happy, not angry, just stable in a way I had never felt in that house. And then came the ache that follows survival, the hollow pull of realizing that even after everything you still wanted them to say it just once. We were wrong, but I knew better. I hadn't come back for apologies. I came to observe, to stand still in front of the fire that once tried to consume me and let it know I wasn't flammable anymore. The next morning, I walked into the legal firm representing the family's foundation. The receptionist recognized my name. Her eyes widened. Oh, you're Dr. Walker, of course. Please come in. Dr. Walker. Funny how much power that title held here, when in that house, I was still just Elise the disappointment. They ushered me into a private room where the legal team was preparing strategy for reputation damage control. I listened. I said nothing. I watched them circle around words like optics-controlled statements, neutral press language. And then they asked me what I was willing to say. I smiled politely. I'm here to ensure nothing untrue is spoken about me. The room fell quiet. I think they were expecting a martyr, or at least a puppet. They got neither. That evening, I walked to the edge of town to a bench overlooking the lake where I used to go when I was younger. When things got too loud, when Mom's voice cut through walls and Jamie's jokes turned venomous. I hadn't been there in years, but the lake looked the same. Quiet, cold, still. I sat, let the weight settle. That night, I walked alone. No plans, no expectations. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. Not of them. Not of what they'd say. Not even of what it would cost me to finally be free. I knew the media storm would hit soon. I knew my name would start appearing in headlines, estranged daughter, former prodigy family scapegoat turned expert witness. Let them. I wasn't hiding. The next day, I received an email. It was from a former classmate, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Someone who used to sit 2 rows behind me and say nothing when others laughed too hard at my expense. But the email was simple. I saw your name in the papers. Just wanted to say, I always knew you'd make it. It didn't heal anything, but it did something else. It reminded me that even when no one clapped, someone was still watching. I stood before the courthouse on the day of the preliminary hearing. Gray sky, cold wind. My name had made its way onto the public docket. Not as a defendant, but as a consultant. As someone whose professional credibility was now untouchable. Mom sat on the left side of the courtroom, pearl earrings, hair ironed smooth, but her hands trembled when she saw me enter. Jamie sat beside her, whispering something urgent. I didn't look their way. I walked straight to the front, sat next to the city-appointed investigator, nodded once. The hearing began. I didn't speak, not yet, but the moment I entered the room, the energy shifted. The same woman who once told me I was too cold to handle pressure now couldn't meet my eyes under oath. That was enough. I wasn't interested in vengeance. I was interested in precision, and justice when wielded carefully is a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. I waited, observed. At recess, the opposing legal counsel approached me. "Dr. Walker, may I ask why now, after all these years?" I didn't hesitate. "Because timing," I said, "is everything." And just as I turned away, he muttered to himself, too quiet for most to hear. "But they said you'd never come back." I didn't turn around. I just smiled. They said I was gone. They didn't know I was preparing. The press didn't waste time. By the next morning, my face was already on 3 local newspapers and flooding social media. The headline read, "Dr. Elise Walker attends fraud trial of her mother, prominent community figure, Margaret Walker." They didn't call me cold anymore. Now they called me calm, composed, strategic. It's strange, isn't it? How quickly the world rewrites a woman's identity as long as she's holding a microphone instead of biting her tongue. The headlines didn't bother me, but the comments, they lingered. Not because they hurt, they didn't, but because they sounded so familiar, like echoes bouncing back from my own childhood walls, now repackaged in digital voices behind usernames. Why is she only showing up now? Classic bitter daughter move. If she really cared, she would have spoken up years ago. They were the same whispers I'd grown up with now, broadcasted by strangers who didn't even know me, yet seemed to echo my family's judgment like they'd all read from the same script. But it wasn't the words that stopped me. It was the emails. Some came from strangers, some from old classmates, people who once looked through me like I wasn't there. Some came from women I'd never met with subject lines like, "Your silence gave me permission," or "Thank you for standing still." One woman wrote, "They called me cold too. You reminded me it's not a flaw, it's survival." I just sat there, laptop open, staring at the screen. For years, I thought the world didn't see me. Maybe it was watching all along. 2 days later, I met the lead investigator in the courthouse records room, a quiet man, sharp-eyed, the kind of presence that made you sit straighter without realizing why. He slid a folder across the table to me. "These are internal expenditure memos from the foundation. Some are signed, some are missing, some have been edited." I opened the folder, slowly, carefully, and then I saw it. My name, used without my knowledge on an official recommendation letter, dated 3 years ago, signed as if I had vouched for my mother's financial decisions. 3 years ago, I was still sleeping on a mattress on the floor of my first apartment. 3 years ago, they were still pretending I didn't exist. "She forged my signature," I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It sliced. The investigator looked at me, long and still, then nodded. Yes, she did. That was the moment I stopped hesitating. I wasn't here to haunt the past anymore. I was part of the case now. I was evidence. Later that evening, Jamie called. "I didn't know about the document," he said softly. "I believe you," I told him, "but belief doesn't mean I forget." He exhaled. "She's falling apart, Elise. I've never seen her like this." I let the silence hang for a beat, then replied, "Maybe she's finally meeting the version of herself she spent decades avoiding." He didn't respond. Sometimes silence is the only apology worth anything. The next morning, I returned to the courtroom. I didn't sit near her. I didn't look at her. I didn't soften. But she saw me. The way her hands twitched, the way her voice cracked slightly when my name came up in testimony. She saw me. The judge asked if I would like to make a statement. I stood, walked to the front, turned to face a room full of strangers and whispers and a few eyes that didn't blink when I met them. And I spoke. "My name is Dr. Elise Walker. I'm here not as a daughter, but as a citizen, a professional, a woman whose name was used to shield decisions I was never consulted on." Each sentence landed like a quiet gavel. I was once told that silence makes you complicit, that not speaking up is cowardice. But sometimes silence is not weakness, it's strategy. And today I choose to speak. I paused. Her eyes met mine, wide, glassy. She didn't cry. Not yet, she wouldn't. She'd wait until no one was watching. So I gave her that space, let her sit in it. Then with steady clarity, I finished. This is no longer a family matter. It is a matter of truth. And truth, unlike reputation, does not ask for permission to exist. I sat down, and the entire room exhaled with me. After the hearing, I didn't linger. I walked right past the reporters, past the cameras, past the version of myself that once waited for someone to follow behind. Back at the hotel, I made tea. and for the first time in years, I slept soundly. But just before I drifted off, my phone lit up. A message. No number, no text, just a photo. It was me 10 years ago standing in a school auditorium holding a trophy, smiling alone. No one in the frame but me. Underneath a single line. You were always the strong one. You just didn't know it yet. I didn't know who sent it, but I knew exactly what it meant. And in that moment, I understood something new. They weren't done with me yet. I didn't reply to the photo. I saved it, but I didn't respond. I didn't ask who sent it. I didn't chase closure, because I had stopped chasing things that never once turned around for me. Instead, I sat at the hotel desk by the window, the city glowing softly beneath my feet, and opened my laptop. My inbox was overflowing messages from journalists, nonprofits, alumni boards that suddenly remembered I existed. A few podcast invitations, one from a journalist who used to ignore every policy paper I ever published and now wanted a raw conversation about power and family. I didn't reply, not yet, because this next move wasn't about reaction anymore. It was about design. I started mapping everything out. Timelines, names, not for revenge, for accountability. I wasn't planning to destroy my mother's legacy. She had already done that. I was preparing to build something better from the rubble. I reviewed every financial report from the foundation, cross-checked expenses against its original mission statement. I highlighted the discrepancies, not just financial, but ethical. I flagged redirected donations, scholarships promised, but never granted names, listed as supporters who'd never agreed. And I found more than I expected, a pattern. My mother hadn't just forged my name, she had forged an entire narrative, one where the family looked united, successful, generous. But the cracks weren't cosmetic anymore. They were structural. That week, I reached out to an independent audit firm. Respected, sharp, quiet. The kind of firm you call when you don't want drama, only truth. They didn't ask why I was doing this. They saw the documents, saw my credentials, heard the calm in my voice, and they understood. Because calm is not softness. Sometimes calm is a storm that has learned to speak fluently in facts. Lisa, the diner cook from years ago, texted me after seeing the news. They're not ready for who you are now, Elise. And honestly, that's exactly the point. I smiled at my phone for the first time in days. She was right. They weren't ready. They had spent years bracing for the girl they thought I'd remain, not the woman I became in silence. Meanwhile, Jamie kept calling, every few days, leaving long voicemails, always circling the same questions without naming them. Are you really going through with this? Isn't this a bit too much? Can't we handle this quietly? But what he really meant was, will you protect her again? And the answer was simple. No, because she never protected me. I didn't hate my mother. I just didn't owe her comfort. And there's a difference. A sharp, necessary one. I didn't return to the courtroom that week. I didn't have to. My statement was on the record. My role was clear. My silence had already done what years of begging never could. Instead, I focused on the system, the one that let women like my mother, polished, performative, powerful, walk through the world unchecked for decades. And quietly, I began building a foundation of my own. Not in her name, not in anyone's shadow. In mine, I called it the Stillhouse Initiative. Because sometimes the strongest structure is the one that doesn't tremble when the storm comes. It focused on girls erased by their own families, the ones labeled too ambitious, too intense, too serious, too cold. Girls like me. I assembled a team, quietly, all women, all sharp. Some were survivors, some were still angry. All of them were focused. And when people asked why I created it, I said, to make sure no girl ever has to choose between her truth and her home again. Then came a call I didn't expect. Private number, I answered. Elise. The voice was older, fragile. It was Aunt Lydia. She didn't try to sound strong. She didn't pretend. I saw what you said in court, she whispered. I wanted to call earlier. I just thought you wouldn't want to hear from me. I didn't, I said gently. But I don't hate you for staying quiet. I understand now. She inhaled slowly. Your mother. She's not sleeping, barely eating. I'm not calling to ask anything. I needed to say I see you now. I really see you. And for a moment, I nearly cried. Because sometimes being seen even 10 years too late still matters. Not because it fixes the past, but because it reminds you that you weren't crazy for needing it. We talked for 10 more minutes, not about the case, not about guilt, just the lake, the old swing, that one summer when I scraped my knee and no one noticed except Lydia. I hung up, sat still for a long time. Then I opened my email, wrote to my team. We launch in 72 hours. Quietly, no public name association. Let the mission speak. And I signed it. Dr. Elise Walker, founder, the Stillhouse Initiative. Then I leaned back, exhaled, and just before I closed the laptop, a thought landed with the weight of steel. You can disappear from a family and still rewrite its story. Not out of revenge, out of resolve. 3 days later, the Stillhouse Initiative launched quietly just as I'd planned. No press conference, no interviews, no daughter of disgraced socialite narrative stapled to it. Just a clean website, a clear mission, and a short video featuring anonymous voices, women, girls, survivors telling the stories I'd once thought only lived in my bones. By noon it had spread. Someone on Twitter found the mission statement and posted, "Finally a foundation that isn't built on pity but precision." By evening it was trending. Donations poured in, and I stayed silent, because that's how I move now, steady, strategic, unshaken. But the world wasn't quiet. At 9:42 p.m., I received a call from the courthouse investigator. "There's something you need to see," he said. I met him the next morning in a cold records room buried in the basement of the district office. He didn't offer coffee or small talk, just a manila folder, thick and heavy. This didn't show up in the original audit. It was locked in a secondary archive flagged as confidential, but your mother didn't classify it properly. I opened it. The first page was a funding authorization form, standard. The second, a check copy. But the third, I froze. It was a grant application, signed by me. But it wasn't forged. It was real. And suddenly I remembered. 7 years ago, before I left. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I had stayed up at the dining room table filling out forms. It was an outreach program, a grant that would bring STEM materials to underfunded public schools. I'd begged my mother to support it, even offered to draft the paperwork. I was 16, naive, desperate for her to see that I could be useful. She said no, said it wasn't high visibility enough. So I saved the file, printed it, signed it, and never submitted it. Or so I thought. Because someone did submit it, but not in my name. She rewrote it, shifted the narrative, applied the funds under the foundation's umbrella, and used the grant to build the public image that would later land her on city boards' charity galas and local interviews as a woman devoted to education equity. The timeline, the outcome, the impact all traced back to the bones of my effort. My voice repackaged, my idea stripped of name. My work inherited by the very woman who spent years telling me I wasn't capable of doing anything meaningful. I stared at the pages like they were an old wound I hadn't realized was still open. "She didn't forge this," I whispered. "No," the investigator said, "but she buried it, reframed it, and then built an entire platform on your back." For a moment, I couldn't speak, because this wasn't just betrayal. It was theft. It was a mother telling her daughter she was worthless, then cashing in on the very ideas she dismissed. And suddenly the memory of her voice surfaced again. "You're not a leader, Elise. You don't know how to move people." Except I did. She just didn't want me to move them without her. I left the records room in silence. Walked straight to the lake I hadn't visited in years. The air was still, water unmoving. I sat on the old bench, hands folded in my lap, and I let myself feel it. Not rage, not pain. Something sharper, clarity. Because this wasn't about her anymore. This was about every time someone took a quiet girl's work, wore it like a crown, and convinced the world it belonged to them. This was about all the women whose names were erased behind polished campaigns and smiling matriarchs. And I was done being part of that silence. That night, I did something I hadn't planned. I published a blog post, not under my name, not through Stillhouse, just anonymously. A story about a girl who stayed up late writing a grant to help children she'd never meet, only to watch it be stolen and repurposed by someone who called her unrealistic. I didn't name names. I didn't have to. The story traveled, and people knew. because the shape of betrayal is universal. The next morning, I received a call. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered. "Elise!" The voice cracked. It was her, my mother. Her voice didn't sound like it used to. It sounded smaller, not fragile, just quiet, like someone standing in a place they no longer owned. "I didn't mean for it to go that way," she said. "I was going to give you credit later. I was just trying to—" "You were trying to be seen," I cut in. "I know." She hesitated. Then more softly than I ever expected, she said, "It was yours. I knew it. I always knew it." I didn't reply. Because sometimes silence isn't anger. It's acknowledgement. She exhaled and I heard the crack in her breath. "I don't expect forgiveness." "Good," I said gently, "because I'm not offering it." Then I ended the call. No drama, no explosion, just closure. And when I looked at my hands, they weren't shaking. Because for the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was deciding. The media didn't pick up the blog post right away, but someone else did. The city's education commissioner. He emailed my foundation requesting a meeting. He had questions, proposals, funding ideas, and beneath his signature, a single line. "You moved us quietly, but we felt it." That night, I walked through the city with nothing but my coat and a cup of tea. No cameras, no apologies, just momentum. And I thought, they thought I came back to burn the house down, but I came back to build a better one on higher ground. The city was quiet the next morning. I woke up before the sun rose, opened the curtains, and just sat there. No alarms, no emails, no movements, just light slowly pouring in like forgiveness I hadn't asked for. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt still. And stillness after years of survival felt almost suspicious. I made tea the old-fashioned way, no phone in hand, no distractions. I watched the water boil, listened to the whistle, poured it into a chipped mug I'd brought from the apartment I used to call mine. That mug had survived 2 cities, 3 jobs, 1 heartbreak, and 1,000 silences. It felt like me. And in that silence, I remembered things I hadn't wanted to remember. Like how even in the worst of it, I used to hope my mother would call, not to ask for anything, not to blame, just to say I see you. She never did. And now that she finally had it felt late. Not too late for justice, not too late for truth, but maybe too late for love. That's what no one tells you about healing. Sometimes by the time they come around, you've already outgrown the version of yourself that needed them. I walked to the bookstore downtown. It was small, independent, always smelled like coffee and dust. I used to go there in college to read quietly for hours, pretending I belonged in someone else's story. The owner recognized me. "Elise Walker," he said warmly. "Didn't think I'd see you back here." "I wasn't sure I would be," I admitted. He handed me a new release. This one's about daughters who disappear and reappear with fire in their mouths. I took it without a word, sat by the window, and read. It had been years since I read something for myself. Not for work, not for strategy, just for soul. And I didn't know it then, but that quiet hour with no obligations and no battles would be the one I remembered most from this chapter. Because power doesn't always live in courtrooms. Sometimes it lives in stillness, in choosing peace when you've already won. That afternoon, I walked by the lake again, same bench, same still water. But something in me had shifted. Not like a climax, not like a movie, just an exhale. I thought about the girl I used to be. The one who cried into notebooks and dreamed of being heard. The one who rehearsed family conversations that would never come. The one who thought she had to prove her worth in loud, shining ways. I wanted to tell her, you don't need their applause. You never did. The next day, I received a message from Jamie. Short, careful, no guilt. I saw the foundation. It's good work. Proud of you, really. I stared at the screen for a long time, then closed it. Not out of anger, out of peace. Because some bridges don't need to burn. They just don't need to be crossed again. That night, I sat on the hotel balcony looking out over a city I once escaped from, now watching it from a higher floor, both literally and metaphorically. Below me were the lights of a place that never made room for me until I carved space out of stone. And I realized, maybe this isn't victory. Maybe it's simply returning to the scene of the pain and not bleeding anymore. And that, in its quietest way, is the loudest ending. But even as that thought settled, I knew it wasn't the end. there was still a trial, still a verdict, still a courtroom full of people waiting to see if the woman they once erased would remain still or stand again. The trial resumed on a Monday. The courtroom felt different this time, not colder, not heavier, just aware. Like the very walls had caught onto the fact that something had shifted, not in the case, but in the power dynamic. And they weren't wrong. I walked in without announcement. No lawyer at my side, no press release. Just me and a dark navy coat file folder tucked under my arm face, unreadable. They turned when I entered. Some pretended not to notice. Others couldn't look away. I wasn't a guest anymore. I was gravity. My mother was already seated at the defendant's table. Her hair was less styled now, her posture slightly less stiff, but she still wore pearls, still wore control like makeup. When she saw me, her shoulders tensed only a little, but I caught it, and so did the judge. He nodded at me when I took my seat, a small precise gesture, not acknowledgement of rank, of presence. The kind you give someone when you realize you can't afford to underestimate them anymore. The prosecution opened with calm confidence. They no longer flinched while listing the misused funds, the false filings, the discrepancies between public messaging and private dealings. The courtroom didn't gasp like it did in movies. It didn't need to. It watched. Because now the story wasn't just about a woman who mismanaged a foundation. It was about a family, about legacy, about what happens when the daughter they erased shows up and doesn't blink. At one point, the opposing counsel asked if I'd be willing to clarify a timeline. The judge turned to me. "Dr. Walker." "I'm prepared," I said. I rose, walked slowly to the witness stand. The room tilted in silence. This wasn't revenge. This was a reckoning written in details, not decibels. I laid out the facts, the missing grant, the name redirection, the date of the forged document. I kept my voice level, my tone neutral. But my eyes never wavered from the truth. I wasn't there to destroy her. I was there to correct the record. After my testimony, I stepped down, walked past my mother without pausing. Her eyes followed me, but her hands didn't reach. She knew better now, because I wasn't hers to touch anymore. During the recess, Jamie approached me outside. "I didn't expect you to testify again," he said, unsure whether to admire or regret it. "I didn't plan to," I replied. But some things deserve clarity, not silence. He looked tired, like a man who just realized neutrality is its own kind of violence. "I think she knows she lost," he muttered. "No," I said gently. "She never lost." He frowned. "She gave it away." Every time she chose image over honesty, silence over apology, pride over connection, she gave her legacy away piece by piece. He didn't argue, because it was true. When the court reconvened, the final arguments were short, measured. No theatrics. The judge didn't raise his voice. He simply read. He spoke of breaches of trust, of manipulation, of names used without consent. And then he paused, looked across the room, and said there is a difference between being feared and being respected. This courtroom has seen both today. No one needed clarification. He ruled, guilty on 3 counts. Fines, removal from all official boards, public apology required by law, no jail time, but no title either. The room didn't erupt. There were no gasps, no cries, just quiet, like the world had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. My mother stood slowly. She didn't cry, she didn't shout, she didn't turn toward me. She just walked out of the room like someone who had finally realized the silence around her wasn't loyalty. It was distance, and distance doesn't echo back. Outside the courthouse, the reporters waited. Microphones, flashes, questions. "Dr. Walker, any comment? Are you satisfied with the verdict? Will your foundation replace the one your mother lost?" I stopped for a moment, just long enough to let them ask. Then I said, "I didn't come here to win. I came to remember what I survived." And I walked on. No bodyguards, no entourage, just wind in my coat and a name that no longer needed anyone's approval. Back at the apartment that night, I took off my coat, sat down, and opened the file folder I had carried all day. Inside was the original grant proposal, the one I'd written at 16, my name in handwriting that was more hopeful than neat. I read it again, not because I needed to, but because that girl had waited long enough. I didn't attend the press conference. After the verdict, the city's legal department held one outlining the outcome, the penalties, the reallocation of the foundation's assets. My name was mentioned once in passing, consultant on financial integrity and nonprofit restructuring. That's how they labeled me. I liked that. It was clean, technical, impersonal, because I didn't need applause. I needed precision. That same afternoon, I was invited to speak on a panel at the State Ethics Summit. The invitation came with a note from the chair. Your silence has reshaped how we define impact. I wasn't sure I wanted to go. I didn't feel celebratory. I felt closed, complete maybe. Like a door had finally locked behind me and I wasn't interested in peeking through the keyhole anymore. But I went. Not to speak about my family, not to vindicate anything, but because I knew some young woman would be sitting in that audience clutching her notebook, wondering if she could ever be powerful without becoming loud. And I wanted her to know she could. My speech was brief. I didn't script it. I didn't rehearse. I simply stood at the podium, looked out over a room full of leaders and learners and said, there's a myth that to rise, a woman must roar. But some of us grew up in houses where silence was our only shield. So we learned to wield it, not as surrender, as strategy. Pause. I wasn't raised to fight. I was raised to survive, and then I taught myself how to build. I could feel the hush settle in, not tension, not awe, just recognition. The kind of stillness that happens when a room full of people finally sees the version of themselves they buried. Afterward, a young woman approached me. Maybe 20, maybe younger. She didn't introduce herself, just said, my mother says I'm too serious, too cold, too much like my father. I smiled. And what do you say? She paused, looked down, then looked up and said, I say, maybe that's not a bad thing. And I nodded, because she was right. That evening I returned home. Not to the city where it all began. I had no intention of ever going back there again, but to my apartment, the one I built without inheritance, without apologies. I poured tea, lit a candle, and pulled out the 2 photos I had framed together months ago, one from the science fair ribbon I'd won alone, and the other from my foundation's silent launch, a screenshot of the website now visited by over 1 million people. 2 girls, both me, one invisible, one undeniable. And then something happened I hadn't expected. I received a letter, a real one, postmarked, handwritten, from Clara Reyes, a woman I'd never met, a mother. She wrote, I watched my daughter tear herself apart trying to please me. And then I watched you and realized what I had done. Thank you for being a mirror. Thank you for not softening to make the world more comfortable. You helped me see her. And now I'm learning how to love her right. I read that letter 3 times, and then I cried. Not from grief, from release. Because sometimes justice isn't a sentence or a headline. Sometimes it's a mother finally saying to her daughter, I see you, even if it comes through someone else's voice. Weeks passed, then months. The Stillhouse Initiative expanded to 3 cities. I turned down interviews, declined documentaries. I didn't want to become the face of survival. I just wanted to make space for it. And I did, one girl at a time. One morning, standing in front of a full board of state education leaders, I gave them recommendations on nonprofit ethics firm Clear Informed. When I finished, one of the board members, an older man with silver hair and kind eyes, said, You know your story. It should be taught. I shook my head gently. It's not my story that matters, I said. It's that I didn't let theirs finish mine. And for the first time, I meant it. That night, I received a final message from my mother. No subject line, no greeting, just 5 words. I watched the summit video. I didn't reply. Not out of anger, out of choice. Because healing isn't always about who apologizes. Sometimes it's about who no longer needs one. And when I closed my laptop that night, I realized they wrote me out of the family, so I wrote myself into history. Not with rage, not with revenge, but with quiet, deliberate power. And now when they tell the story, they can't leave my name out. Because I didn't just survive the fire, I became it.